obvious to the most simple-minded that Loci is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction. We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
You mean they should have respected us?
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again.
Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I'm chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid computer, Mr. Spock.
And exclusive ex-Labor MP and Jeremy Corbyn ally Chris Williamson could be stripped of parliamentary pass in days, with former shadow minister now working for Iranian state TV and having claimed Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky is backed by Nazis. Ex-Labor MP Chris Williamson could lose his access to Parliament within days as a House of Commons committee meets to review his security pass. It can be revealed the former shadow minister, a staunch ally of ex-Labor leader Jeremy Corbyn, was MP for Derby North between 2017 and 2019. He continues to enjoy privileged access to Parliament by holding one of more than 300 passes doled out to former MPs, but concerns have been raised about the continued allocation of security pass to Mr. Williamson due to his role as a host on Iranian state TV. The 66-year-old recently angered serving MPs by claiming Vladimir Zelensky is backed by literal Nazis. On the day the Ukrainian president made his historic address to Parliament, Mail Online understands the Commons Administration Committee will meet tomorrow to review Mr. Williamson's holding of a parliamentary pass. A decision is expected to be taken swiftly by the group of MPs who have an influential role in the day-to-day management of the Commons, but Mr. Williamson hit out at the confected controversy over his parliamentary pass and suggested it was another reminder of the disturbing scale of censorship that pervades British society today. Here from Press TV, British Parliament considers revoking security pass of Labour MP over hosting Press TV show. In yet another crackdown on freedom of speech, the British Parliament is considering the revocation of a security pass held by former Labour MP Chris Williamson over hosting a show broadcasting Iranians on Iran's international English television news network Press TV. According to an exclusive report published by the Daily Mail on Friday, parliamentary authorities were facing calls to rethink the granting of a security pass to Williamson as a 66-year-old fronts a popular show on Press TV. Williamson, an MP for Dorbury North between 2017 and 2019, who served as a shadow minister under former leader Jeremy Corbyn, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, enjoys privileged access to the British Parliament by holding one of more than 300 passes doled out to former MPs. The paper said current MPs had expressed fears about a mouthpiece for what they claimed to be a hostile foreign government and his having unfettered access to the parliamentary estate. The willingness of these parliamentarians to make utterly baseless accusations about me while remaining silent about hundreds of MPs acting as lobbyists for the hostile regime in Tel Aviv reveals their shameless hypocrisy, Williamson told Mail Online. I like that we get to hear his voice. The former Labour MP has been a host of Press TV's Palestine Declassified show since March 22, after previously appearing as a guest on the English Channel News Network. The popular show sheds light on the British government's veiled support for atrocities and aggression perpetrated by the Israeli occupying regime against Palestinians, as well as London's back channel dealings with Tel Aviv. The parliamentary authorities should look to review whether it's proper for someone like Chris Williamson to have unfettered access to the parliamentary estate, conservative backbencher Henry Smith told Mail Online. The Crawley MP, a member of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, said he had no objection to former MPs continuing to hold parliamentary passes, but said it was an issue of how they're using that. If they're in the pay of hostile foreign governments, the parliamentary authorities should be looking to revoke their pass, he added. Iran's state-run Press TV, banned in Britain since 2013, was recently sanctioned by the European Union as part of the bloc's response to what was claimed to be Iran's violent crackdown on rioters, sparked after mid-September death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old woman of Kurdish descent. Press TV, which has earned a reputation as the voice of the voiceless, has faced many attacks from the Western countries over the years. On April 3rd, Munich-based media regulator BLM announced it was removing Press TV from the SES Astra satellite as it purportedly didn't have a license to broadcast in Europe. In 2012, the Hong Kong-based Asia Sat took Iranian channels off air in East Asia, and in October 2012, Eutelsat and Intelsat stopped broadcasting several Iranian satellite channels through the Islamic Republic of Iran. Broadcasting managed to resume broadcasts over striking deals with smaller companies that are based in other countries. In July 2013, Press TV was forced off the air in the UK after the media regulator Ofcom revoked its license for allegedly breaching the Communications Act. In the same year, it was taken off air in North America after the U.S. Treasury Department announced sanctions against the Islamic Republic of Iran broadcasting. Press TV was dropped from the Galaxy 19 satellite platform that allowed it to broadcast in the U.S. and Canada without saying it when it was dropped. And here's a bit of footage from a recent Chris Williamson interview. This is actually just yesterday. Let's listen in.
Cold weather, obviously, accidents on the roads and all that kind of stuff. But many of those deaths, those so-called excess winter deaths, are as a consequence of people living in cold homes. Well, that is going to be magnified, 10, 20-fold by the ballooning energy costs. So there's an existential threat, I think, to the world about the possibility of a third world war. And of course, there's also the impact that it's having on people's quality of life right now. And I just think there's nobody speaking up, really, or nobody in the public realm speaking up. None of the political class are speaking up on this. There seems to be a consensus now in Westminster that this war should be prosecuted. And you've even got people like Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, openly talking about the prospect of a war, a direct war between NATO and Russia. Well, that is the Third World War. I mean, some might say we're already in a Third World War with the supply of weapons, the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline, etc. It's a crazy world at the moment. And given that there is very few voices being raised in the media or in the political sphere, we feel that it's important that we try and raise our voices to try and really bring some sense to the situation and hopefully bring pressure to bear to ensure that a different path is taken by our political leaders.
I think it's also important to point out that this war, in which Ukraine is essentially being used in this war, according to some estimations, you've seen 6,900 civilians killed in Ukraine. You've seen around 8% of its houses destroyed or damaged. You've seen 50% of its energy infrastructure impacted with power cuts. According to the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, in order to keep its economy afloat, Ukraine requires at least $3 billion per month. You've seen almost 14 million Ukrainians displaced. 8 million of them are in Europe and 6 million of them are internally displaced. That's around about 40% of Ukraine's population also that will require humanitarian assistance. You've even seen in 2022 the Ukrainian economy contract by 35%, and 60% of Ukrainians are now on the brink of living on less than $5.5 a day, and that's according to the World Bank figures. You've seen 9 million Ukrainians now without electricity.
And this is Mint Press News with Low Key as the interviewer, and again Chris Williamson, interviewee.
NATO carried out and controlled little
for the war machines, not
responsible for sabotaging the gas pipelines into Europe. What do you think that says about the extent to which our media is acting lock in step and in concert with NATO and its objectives?
It's been completely captured. I mean, look, the corporate media are essentially stenographers for the war machine, stenographers for NATO. And I mean, people like John Mearsheimer was predicting the catastrophe that would befall Ukraine were it not to embrace neutrality. He said that, the West, the kind of NATO, is leading Ukraine down the primrose path. Even people like Henry Kissinger were saying back in 2014, after the US-backed coup overthrew the democratically elected government in Kiev, that Ukraine's future really lay in being a neutral country, if you like, a bridge between, the East and the West in that sense. And, they've both been proved correct. I mean, what John Mearsheimer said was that, if they continued down the path that they were going, that Ukraine would be wrecked as a country. And so it's proved to be. Well, this war has been planned for a long time. I mean, you go back many years. I mean, things, for example, like the NATO's Bucharest Declaration in 2008, where it openly said that Ukraine would become a member of NATO a very provocative statement to make. I mean, and Russia has said that was a red line from their perspective. And of course, Mikhail Gorbachev was given a solemn pledge by James Baker when they were discussing German reunification, and the pledge was given that the NATO would not extend 1 inch beyond the reunified border of Germany. And yet we've seen 14 additional countries in Eastern Europe added to NATO. I mean, NATO's nearly doubled in size. Why is NATO even still in existence? I mean, NATO was established before the so-called Warsaw Pact came into being. It was established on the pretext of, defending the West from the threat posed. I think it was an imaginary threat, actually, but the threat allegedly posed by the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. So why is NATO still in existence, let alone almost double the size? But so there's been these provocations, and if you just, for example, think about the boot being on the other foot for a moment. Something called the Monroe Doctrine, which has been adopted by the United States for getting off for 200 years, I think now, actually, where they say any kind of interference in their hemisphere will be seen as a hostile act. They would not tolerate any intervention by a Russian-backed military alliance or a Chinese-backed military alliance, setting up bases, bringing into their orbit any country in the Americas, let alone right up to their border in, say, Canada or in Mexico. And then you've got, just before the
he was remiss
Russian
in mentioning Haiti as well. This political unrest there is consistent due to imperialism. Okay, and we have another story here. The Palestine consulate reopening in Jerusalem is opposed by U.S. politicians. Let's take a look at this. Haggerty again forces State Department to admit Israel must agree before Biden can reopen U.S. consulate to the Palestinians in Jerusalem. I have a problem with this term, admit. This is Haggerty's website, so, it's not exactly partial or impartial. The United States Senator Bill Haggerty, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, today in an oversight hearing questioned Ambassador Richard R. Verma, the Biden administration's nominee for Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources on the Biden administration, on their controversial push to reopen a U.S. consulate for Palestinians in Jerusalem. Reopen. The government of Israel has consistently opposed this proposal. I'd like to go back to the question that I asked the Deputy Secretary of State, Brian McKeon, and repeat what I asked him. Is it your understanding that under U.S. and international law, the government of Israel would have to provide its affirmative consent before the U.S. could reopen the U.S. consulate to the Palestinians in Jerusalem? Or does the Biden administration believe it can move forward to establish a second U.S. mission in Israel's capital city of Jerusalem without the consent of the government of Israel? At the time, Deputy Secretary McKeon answered, yes, that's my understanding, that we need the consent of the host government to open a diplomatic facility. Ambassador Verma, I just simply want to ask you whether you agree with then Deputy Secretary McKeon's answer, Senator Haggerty asked. Verma confirmed to Haggerty that the United States would ultimately need the consent of Israel to open or reopen any new diplomatic facility in Jerusalem. That's my understanding as well, Senator Verma said. In October 2021, the then Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources, Brian McKeon, first confirmed to Haggerty that the United States would ultimately need the consent of the host government, Israel, to open or reopen any diplomatic facility in Israel's eternal capital city of Jerusalem. All this language is just loaded and untrue, right? Haggerty plans to reintroduce the 118th Congress an updated version of his Upholding the 1995 Jerusalem Embassy Law Act, a bill to protect the full and faithful implementation of the Jerusalem Embassy Act of 1995 and block the Biden administration's proposed efforts to subvert the law. Senator Haggerty slams Biden plan for Palestinian consulate as affront to Israel, bizarre act of diplomacy. Israel ambassador slams UN meeting over holy site. Bill Haggerty, zoom in here. Bill Haggerty slammed the Biden administration's continued insistence to reopen a consulate for the Palestinians in Jerusalem as an affront to Israel that could have disastrous consequences in an already tense city. I oppose President Biden's controversial proposal to reopen a consulate for the Palestinians in Jerusalem, he told Fox News Digital in an exclusive statement. A second competing U.S. diplomatic mission would be an affront to Israel and would be a bizarre act of diplomacy to install a diplomatic mission over the objection of the host nation. Haggerty served as one of the members on the committee interviewing Ambassador Richard Verma. President Biden's nominee for the Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources is Richard Verma, effectively the Chief Operating Officer for the department. The role mainly focuses on executing foreign assistance and operational programs for the department, but the Deputy Secretary also directly advises the Secretary of State on policy. Biden repeatedly discussed plans to reverse former President Trump's closure of the consulate that served the Palestinians in Jerusalem, a commitment that thus far remains uncompleted. Under questioning by Haggerty, Verma acknowledged to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that Biden would need Israel's permission before opening any additional diplomatic missions in Israel's capital city. The potential consulate remains a contentious issue as tensions continue to worsen in the city. A Palestinian last week plowed a car into a crowded bus stop in East Jerusalem, which followed weeks of violence in the city as Israel and Palestinians seek retribution for attacks on each other. Let's not mention the violence by the governmental apparatus as well, correct? Okay, I already went through that. And finally, we have a clip from the Munich Security Conference of, let me get my language correct on this. The son of a 1979 overturned Iranian king. The U.S. installed government after 55, which was overturned in 79. Well, the son of the king that was in before the overturning. He's at this conference. This is a conference, a section of the conference entitled Women, Life, Freedom. And so he's mansplaining feminism at Munich Security Conference. Let's see. His name is Reza Pahlavi.
Our women in future in Iran. And
thank you.
What are you going to do for them? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, as a father of 3 daughters, if you were to ask my wife, I don't think you'll find a stronger feminist in support of the women in Iran. I'm sure Masih knows that too, because you know my wife, you talked to her before. So this is not rhetoric, this is fundamental belief. The first victims of this regime were women who became instantaneously second-class citizens. This cannot be tolerated by any stretch of imagination. What's the guarantee for equality, for end to any form of discrimination? It's the rule of law based on a constitution that will ultimately be based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which explains so many areas that needs to be observed. So the fact that women in Iran today are leading the movement is a natural answer to what was caused against them by this regime. And we cannot imagine a country, especially that I think a higher percentage of women in Iran are educated than men are, for them to be disenfranchised and not be part of our country's rebuilding. Women have always been the core of stability, and the unit starts at the family level. I often refer to the fact that our biggest challenge is not necessarily to put the right political structure. Our problem is not to have our vibrant civil society making sure that we don't deviate from the democratic path. What I believe will be the toughest challenge, which is not overnight, is instilling a new culture. We have to educate ourselves to accept a democratic culture, which is not automatic, which is also embedded in your question. Where does that start? It starts from the family. Male chauvinism, or whatever you want to call it, in the patriarchal society can only be changed when women in that cycle have the support of their male counterpart. You see that today. You see that today, even though it's women's life freedom, but women are not alone. They're backed by their fathers, by their husbands, by their brothers, by their sons. So this movement has the support of Iranian men in the sense that it is not a man-women thing. It is an Iranian freedom thing that serves us all. And I'm glad that women are leading it, because it will set a new standard for our part of the world in general. And if Iran can achieve its future democracy on the basis of this revolution, which is the first of its kind in the world, it's the first women's revolution in the world as far as I'm concerned.
How? How? Never been a women's revolution. That's categorically false.
We can prove that we can overcome all of these issues because this is beyond rhetoric. It's actual belief in equality, in justice, and ending any kind of discrimination. And the discrimination against women has been the most obvious one. And therefore, the alternative starts with eliminating that discrimination.
I want to answer my...
Yeah, I just find it super ironic that the representative of, of Iran is from a family of people who were kicked out of Iran by a revolutionary coup. It makes no sense that this person would be chosen. Maybe someone a bit less controversial might work there, But I'm going to open a channel here and make sure that you like, you share, you subscribe, you stay engaged, and remember more than anything to watch this space.
Beam me up, Mr. Spock. Beam me up.